My name is Jack, and I have been working as a gravedigger at St. Mary's Cemetery for over 20 years. I know every corner of this place, every tombstone, and every tree. I always thought it was a quiet job and, to be honest, a bit lonely. People usually avoid cemeteries, especially at night, but for me, it was just another day at the office. In all those years, I never saw anything that scared me. Until that night. It was a Friday, and the sky was covered with dark clouds, creating an even heavier atmosphere. I was digging a new grave as usual when something caught my attention. As I dug the grave, I felt a chill run down my spine, something that had never happened before. I looked around, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. I continued my work, trying to ignore the strange feeling. It was then that, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a movement. I lifted my head and, in the distance, saw a shadowy figure standing among the old tombstones. The figure seemed to be watching me, motionless, shrouded in shadows. At first, I thought it was just a play of light and shadows, but then it moved, gliding silently among the tombstones like a specter. What should have been an ordinary work night quickly turned into something sinister. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate further. With an old flashlight in one hand and a shovel in the other, I began to follow the shadowy figure through the cemetery. Every step I took seemed to echo in the silence of the night, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The figure moved slowly, almost floating between the tombstones. I wondered if it was some prankster trying to scare me, but something in the air told me this was much more serious. I passed by old graves, some dating back to the 19th century, and the environment around me became increasingly cold. The figure disappeared behind a large marble tombstone, and I quickened my steps to catch up. When I reached the spot, there was no one there, just the tombstone and the sepulchral silence. I felt a chill run down my spine as I shone my flashlight on the inscription on the stone, trying to understand what was happening. As I shone the flashlight on the tombstone, the whispers began. At first, they were soft, almost inaudible, but they quickly intensified. The voices came from all directions, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. My heart raced, and the flashlight began to shake in my hand. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind passing through the trees, but deep down I knew something was very wrong. The shadowy figure appeared again, this time closer, and the whispers turned into desperate screams. I felt surrounded, as if hundreds of souls were around me, crying out for help. The figure moved towards me, and I could see a pale face and empty eyes that seemed to look directly into my soul. In panic, I took a step back but tripped over a root and fell to the ground, my flashlight rolling away and leaving me almost in total darkness. Struggling to regain control, I reached for the flashlight and shone it on the tombstone again. This time, the shadowy figure was even closer, almost within arm's reach. With my heart beating frantically, I looked at the inscription on the stone. It was an old tombstone, covered in moss, and the name carved on it was almost illegible. I managed to decipher only part of the name, Jonathan R. Smith. As I read the name aloud, the screams around me abruptly stopped, plunging the cemetery into oppressive silence. The shadowy figure began to take shape, revealing itself as a ghostly-looking man in 19th century clothing. He raised a trembling hand and pointed at the tombstone, his empty eyes now filled with deep sadness. I understood then that he was trapped there, unable to find peace. The realization that I was facing a trapped spirit filled me with paralyzing fear. I decided I needed to get out of there immediately. I quickly stood up and started running in the opposite direction, trying to reach the cemetery exit. However, every step I took seemed to lead me back to the same place, as if the ground was holding me. I looked back and saw the shadowy figure slowly approaching, his eyes fixed on me. The more I tried to escape, the more I felt trapped in a never-ending nightmare. The voices around me began to whisper again, this time louder, like a chorus of lost souls trying to drag me into their darkness. Feeling panic take over, I fell to my knees, begging for everything to stop. But the presence of the spirit seemed to grow, and I knew I needed to find a way to free him to escape that supernatural trap. Desperate and with no other option, I began to talk to the spirit. "Jonathan R. Smith," I called, trying to sound as calm as possible. "What do you want from me?" The whispers stopped momentarily, and the shadowy figure stopped approaching. Sensing an opportunity, I continued, "How can I help you find peace?" The spirit began to transform, his features becoming more distinct and less threatening. He raised his hand again and pointed to a specific spot on the ground near the tombstone. I understood that there was something buried there that needed to be found. Still trembling, I grabbed my shovel and began to dig at the indicated spot. With each shovelful of dirt removed, I felt the tension in the air diminish. Finally, I found a small wooden box, old and covered in dirt. When I opened it, I discovered old letters and a medallion that seemed very important to Jonathan. The spirit watched in silence, and I knew I was on the right path to freeing him. With trembling hands, I took the medallion out of the box and held it up towards the spirit. "Is this what you were looking for, Jonathan?" I asked. The spirit's eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't identify, and he nodded slowly. A cold wind blew through the cemetery, and I felt a pressure on my chest, as if an invisible force was compressing me. The spirit began to fade, his outlines becoming increasingly faint, but before disappearing completely, he murmured something that sounded like a thank you. As soon as the spirit was gone, I felt a wave of relief, but also a deep exhaustion. I gathered my tools and headed home, still shaken by the encounter. When I got home, I threw myself into bed, hoping to find some rest. However, during the night, I woke up suddenly, feeling a strange weight on me. Looking in the mirror in my room, I saw pale, skeletal handprints around my neck, as if the spirit had left one last reminder of his torment.
My name is Mary, and since my husband, John, passed away 3 years ago, I visit his grave at St. Mary's Cemetery every week. Each visit is a sacred ritual for me. I buy fresh flowers on the way, usually daisies, his favorites, and spend hours sitting by his tombstone, talking to him about my day, our memories, and how much I miss him. The cemetery, with its old trees and quiet atmosphere, always seemed like a place of peace to me, a refuge where I could feel John's presence somehow. However, a few weeks ago I started noticing strange things happening, things that made me question if I was really at peace. The flowers I left on the tombstone were always rearranged differently when I returned, and a strange feeling of being watched began to accompany me during my visits. During one of my weekly visits, upon reaching John's grave, I noticed that the flowers I had left the previous week were arranged differently. Initially, I thought it could have been the wind or some animal passing by. But the following week, the same thing happened, and this time the flowers formed a circular pattern, something the wind certainly couldn't have done. I felt a chill down my spine but decided to ignore it, believing that perhaps a well-intentioned visitor was rearranging the flowers. However, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It was as if someone or something was there with me, watching my every move. I decided not to tell anyone, thinking it might just be my imagination. But the frequency and precision with which the flowers were rearranged began to deeply disturb me. One afternoon, while arranging the flowers on John's grave, I smelled a faint fragrance in the air, a familiar scent that made me freeze in place. It was the cologne John used to wear, something unmistakable to me. I looked around, expecting to see someone, but the cemetery was as empty as always. The fragrance seemed to envelop me, bringing a mixture of comfort and fear. Feeling a strange connection, I started talking to John out loud, telling him about my day and how much I missed him, as I always did. Suddenly, a gentle breeze blew, carrying the fragrance and making the leaves around dance in the air. That moment I was sure that John was there with me somehow. But the feeling of being watched never completely disappeared. Something else was happening, something I still couldn't understand. The following weeks were marked by a series of increasingly strange events. Each time I visited John's grave, I found messages drawn in the dirt around the tombstone. At first, they were just lines and meaningless shapes, but soon they became words and short phrases, like "I am here" and "help me." These messages seemed to be written by an invisible finger, the dirt scratched in a way that seemed impossible for the wind or animals. Each new message increased my confusion and fear. I began to wonder if I was losing my sanity, but the feeling of being watched remained strong. One sleepless night, I decided to research the cemetery and discovered that other visitors had also reported paranormal experiences. The messages in John's cologne were clear signs that something or someone was trying to communicate with me, but I couldn't decipher what exactly. I needed answers. Determined to understand what was happening, I started investigating the history of St. Mary's Cemetery more deeply. I discovered that it was founded in the late 19th century and was known for its beauty and tranquility. However, I also found reports from other visitors mentioning strange experiences, like whispering voices, shadowy figures, and inexplicable changes to the graves. I spoke with some Old Town residents who shared stories of paranormal events and local legends. They talked about an old cemetery caretaker who supposedly disappeared mysteriously decades ago. The story said he still haunted the place, tending to the graves invisibly. With this information in mind, I began to pay more attention to details during my visits. If there was indeed a spirit trying to communicate, I needed to be prepared for anything. On a rainy night, I decided to go to the cemetery for a deeper investigation. Dressed in a raincoat and holding a flashlight, I walked to John's grave. The rain beat hard against the ground, creating an even more tense and mysterious atmosphere. Upon arrival, I noticed that John's familiar cologne was stronger than ever. Suddenly, a shadow passed quickly out of the corner of my eye. Turning quickly, I saw a vague figure moving among the tombstones. With a racing heart, I followed the shadow to a more secluded area of the cemetery, where the trees formed a dark canopy. The figure seemed to be waiting for me there, standing, looking directly at me. I knew I needed to confront what was happening. Breathing deeply, I called out John's name, asking if it was him and what he wanted to tell me. The figure remained still, but the whispers around became more intense, as if the spirit was trying to communicate with me more clearly. With the flashlight trembling in my hand, I took a few hesitant steps towards the figure. "John, if it's you, please tell me what you need," I implored, my voice almost drowned out by the sound of the rain. The figure seemed to tremble, and for a brief moment, its shape became clearer, revealing features that reminded me of my husband. My eyes filled with tears, and a mix of sadness and hope overwhelmed me. "Please give me a sign," I continued, trying to hold back the sobs. The figure raised an arm and pointed to the ground. I followed the gesture with a flashlight, illuminating a small area of dirt next to an old tombstone. The message written there was clear: "Help free." I knelt down, trying to understand what he meant by that. The spirit seemed agitated, and the whispers around became louder and more confused, mixing words I couldn't understand. Amidst the whirlwind of emotions, I knew I needed to do something, but the instructions were vague, and I felt helpless. I stood up, confused and crying, pleading for more clarity, but the figure began to dissipate, leaving me alone in the dark, with the enigmatic message etched in the dirt. Desolate and exhausted, I remained kneeling on the ground, staring at the message in the dirt. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of it all. John's figure had disappeared, but the feeling of his presence still lingered in the air. I decided I would return to the cemetery the next day, during daylight, to see if I could find more clues. As I left the cemetery that night, the rain diminished, and John's familiar fragrance disappeared with the wind. When I got home, I tried to explain what had happened to myself, but everything seemed like a big, confusing blur. The next day, I returned to the cemetery hoping to clarify what I had seen. However, to my amazement, the message that was etched in the dirt the previous night had completely vanished, as if it had never been there. I asked the cemetery caretakers if they had touched that area, but they denied any intervention. I felt more lost than ever. Was it all just my imagination? Or was there really a presence trying to communicate with me? From that day on, my visits to John's grave were never the same. I continued to feel his presence, but the signs were always confusing and fleeting, constantly leaving me in doubt about what was real. The experience left me with more questions than answers, and the certainty that some mysteries might never be unraveled.
My name is Carl, and I have lived across from St. Mary's Cemetery for 5 years. When I moved here, I heard many scary stories about the place, but I never took any of them seriously. To me, it was just an old cemetery, a bit eerie at night, but nothing more. My house is right across from the main gate of the cemetery, so I'm used to seeing visitors during the day. The tall, dark trees and old tombstones are part of my daily landscape. At night, the place takes on a more mysterious air, but I always thought that was just an effect of my imagination. However, in the past few weeks, strange things started happening. What began as small events soon turned into something much more disturbing, completely changing my view of the cemetery. Unexplained lights, strange sounds, and a constant feeling of being watched became part of my daily life, and I knew I needed to find out what was happening. It all started with small events that I tried to ignore. At night, while at home, I saw inexplicable lights flashing in the cemetery. Initially, I thought it might be some kind of reflection or even nocturnal visitors, but the lights appeared in random places, moved erratically, and disappeared as quickly as they appeared. One early morning, I woke up to strange sounds coming from the cemetery, whispers and murmurs that seemed to come from many voices. I got up and looked out the window but saw no one. The sounds continued for a few minutes and then abruptly stopped. I began to feel increasingly uncomfortable in my own home, as if I was being constantly watched. One night, I saw a shadowy figure moving slowly among the tombstones. I grabbed my camera and tried to record it, but when I reviewed the footage, there was nothing but darkness. These strange events began to happen more frequently, and I knew I needed to find out what was really happening at St. Mary's Cemetery. Determined to understand the strange events, I decided to investigate on my own. One night, around midnight, armed with a flashlight and my camera, I left my house and headed towards the cemetery. The air was cold and damp, and every step I took seemed to echo in the silence of the night. As I entered through the main gate, I was greeted by a cold wind that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I walked slowly among the tombstones, illuminating the path with my flashlight, trying to catch any unusual movement or sound. Suddenly, I saw the inexplicable lights again, floating like small orbs of light among the trees. I turned on the camera and started filming, moving in the direction of the lights. As I got closer, I felt a cold and oppressive presence around me. My heart raced as I ventured deeper into the cemetery, determined to discover the source of the lights. The camera captured everything, but live, the feeling was much more intense. Finally, I reached a clearing where the lights seemed to converge, and there, in the center, was an old mausoleum that I had never noticed before. With a flashlight trembling in my hand, I approached the old mausoleum. The orb lights floated around the entrance, creating a spectral glow. The place was covered in moss and ivy and looked like it hadn't been visited in decades. I took a deep breath and, with a mixture of fear and curiosity, pushed the heavy wooden door that creaked loudly in the silence of the night. The interior was dark and musty, with a smell of mold and decay. As I illuminated the interior with my flashlight, I noticed old coffins stacked against the walls and plaques with inscriptions worn by time. Suddenly, I felt a cold presence beside me. I turned quickly and saw a shadow moving out of the corner of my eye. When I pointed the flashlight, there was nothing. My heart raced, and I felt a pressure on my chest, as if something invisible was trying to stop me from moving forward. Determined, I continued exploring the mausoleum and, at the back, found a coffin with the lid ajar. I approached, and when I shone the light inside, I saw a pale face and empty eyes staring at me. I took a step back, horrified, and the figure inside the coffin began to move, slowly rising. In panic, I tried to leave the mausoleum, but the door seemed to be locked by an invisible force. The figure fully stood up, and I could feel its cold and oppressive presence around me. The whispers filled the air, getting louder and more distressing. Clutching the flashlight and camera in my hand, they were my only consolation as the figure approached. The pressure in the environment increased, and the whispers were now almost deafening, like a chorus of lost souls. I shone the light on the figure's face once more, and then I noticed something even more disturbing. The pale and empty face seemed to be covered by a wax mask, slowly melting. The figure gestured towards me, pointing to something on the ground near the coffin. With superhuman effort, I knelt and saw a small chest covered in dust and cobwebs. I picked it up with trembling hands and opened the lid. Inside, I found a collection of old objects. Yellowed letters, a photograph of a 19th century family, and a silver medallion with an engraved inscription. When I touched the medallion, an intense cold ran through my body, and I knew these objects were somehow connected to the spirit that surrounded me. The figure came closer, and the feeling of being watched intensified. I stood up with the chest in my hands, and the figure began to dissolve into the air, leaving a thin, cold mist. The mausoleum door opened with a bang, and I knew I had to get out of there immediately. I ran out, clutching the chest to my chest, and felt the spirit's presence dissipate as I moved away from the mausoleum. With the chest firmly clutched to my chest, I ran out of the mausoleum, panting and scared. The orb lights that had floated around were gone, and the cemetery was immersed in a heavy and oppressive silence. The feeling of being watched still persisted, but now it seemed less intense, as if something had changed. I decided to return home, but as I approached the cemetery gate, I felt a cold and oppressive presence again. I looked back and saw the ghostly figure standing among the tombstones, more distinct than before. It seemed to be waiting for something. I took a deep breath and, with renewed courage, walked back towards the figure. "What do you want?" I asked out loud, my voice echoing in the silence of the night. The figure raised a hand and pointed directly at the chest I was holding. I understood that the spirit was connected to the objects in the chest and wanted something specific. I opened the chest again and took out the letters and the photograph. The figure came closer, and I could feel the intensity of its presence. I began to read one of the letters out loud, my voice trembling as I deciphered the old words. The figure stopped and seemed to listen intently. As I read, the atmosphere around began to change, and the whispers decreased in intensity. The spirit seemed to be finding some kind of peace, but the feeling of restlessness still persisted. I knew there was still something that needed to be done, something I hadn't yet discovered. With trembling hands, I continued reading the letters out loud, hoping they contained the key to freeing the spirit. Each word seemed to calm the shadowy figure, which now remained still, listening intently. The letters told a tragic story of love and loss, revealing that the spirit belonged to a man named Edward, who had lost his beloved, Eliza, and been buried in the mausoleum in despair. I held the photograph closer to the flashlight and saw the faces of Edward and Eliza, young and in love. I took the silver medallion with the inscription, "Forever Together," and held it up, showing it to the spirit. "Edward, is this what you're looking for?" I asked, my voice echoing in the cemetery's quiet. The spirit's eyes seemed to shine with deep recognition. He raised his trembling hand and touched the medallion, and at that moment, I felt a wave of energy pass through my body. The whispers around stopped completely, and the ensuing silence was almost deafening. Edward's figure began to dissolve again, but this time, with an expression of peace on his face. I felt an intense emotional connection, as if I was sharing the spirit's pain and release. "You are free now, Edward," I whispered, feeling tears run down my face. The figure slowly disappeared, and the medallion in my hand began to warm before cooling completely. I looked around and realized the oppressive presence had vanished. Relieved by the apparent release of the spirit, I made my way out of the cemetery, still holding the chest with Edward and Eliza's belongings. As I passed through the gate, I felt a weight lifted from my shoulders, as if the atmosphere around me had become lighter. When I got home, I placed the chest on the living room table and sat down, trying to process everything that had happened. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in weeks, without the constant feeling of being watched. However, at dawn, something disturbing happened. I woke up to a loud noise coming from the living room. I ran to see what it was and found the chest open, the objects scattered on the floor. The medallion was standing upright, as if it had been placed there intentionally. The air in the room was cold, and I felt a strange presence. Suddenly, I saw a shadow move out of the corner of my eye. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. I picked up the medallion, and as I held it, I felt a wave of terror run through my body. In the living room mirror, I saw Edward's figure reflected, watching me with the same empty eyes as before. In panic, I ran out of the house, but looking back, I saw Edward standing at the window, his face now contorted in an expression of despair and anger. Since that day, the spirit's presence has never left me. Every night, I see Edward's shadow watching me from the window, and I know that somehow he is still tied to me, seeking something I have yet to discover. St. Mary's Cemetery has ceased to be just a sinister place and has become a constant reminder that some spirits never find peace.